example, theologians will go in this direction, and scientists will go in this direction, and the same thing happens with philosophy, religion, and what have you. And one thing that really interests me with the divine command theory of ethics is when I started researching this, is I found that when you read philosophy of religion literature and you compared it to your average sort of first year ethics textbook, you found that in philosophy of religion there was a lot of debate about the stuff, there was a lot of development of divine command theories, there was a lot of talk about the kinds of objections that were raised about it. And then you'd come to your standard first year secular ethics book and it was still citing 2-paragraph or 3-paragraph criticism that had been made 40 years ago as though it was decisive and was moving on. And I've noticed this increasingly as time's gone on. So what I really want to do is make some points that I think are related to that. So this talk I want to look at 2 basic questions. Firstly, I want to spell out and gives you an idea as to what a divine command theory is. And this is important because there's actually, I think, a bit of confusion about this. A lot of the criticisms I read of divine command theory tend to be based on either a misunderstanding of it or a failure to grasp certain important distinctions in meeting ethics. So I'm going to spell some of that out. After I've spelled out what a divine command theory is and is not, I want to turn to perhaps the major objection to such theories, and that's what's known as the Euthyphro objection. And there really are 2 subparts to this objection. The first is what's called the arbitrariness objection, and the second is what's called the emptiness objection. Now that's a lot of lingo at the moment. I will explain as I go on what I mean by that. So I'll explain what I mean by the Euthyphro, I'll explain what these 2 objections are and how they work. And that's basically what I'll cover in this talk today. Okay, so I'm not going to cover everything, I'm just going to cover that. So first question, what is the divine command theory? And it's necessary to spell out exactly what a divine command theory of ethics is. So I've got a couple of definitions for you. This is from William Franklin's book, Ethics, which he wrote some time ago. And it's quite a good basic definition. It says, an action or kind of action is right or wrong if and only if and because it is commanded or forbidden by God. And just as a side here, you'll see this later, when people talk about God in philosophy of religion, they generally talk about the Judeo-Christian Islamic concept of God, in other words, an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, an material being who created the universe, that kind of idea. I'll get into that a little bit later. I want you to notice 2 important things about this definition that are often missed. The first is the thesis is limited to what ethicists call deontological properties. Okay? Deontological properties. Philip Quinn explains what deontological properties are as follows. This is what Quinn says. I mean to refer to whether it has such properties as being morally permitted, morally forbidden, or prohibited, being morally obligated or required. So it's what's called the requirement family of moral properties, right? That's what's called deontological properties. And deontological properties in the literature are generally contrasted with what's called axiological properties. And axiological properties are talking about good and bad. So deontology talks about what's right, what's wrong, what's required, what's permissible. Axiology looks at things like what's generally valuable, what's good, and what's bad. And it's important to note that these are not the same thing. Stephen Evans makes this point. He says, it does not appear that the concept of obligation is identical to the concept of what it is good to do. And he gives an example. It might be good, even saintly, for me to give a kidney to benefit a stranger, but I'm not obligated to do it. And so there he gives an example of an action which you might say is good, or is valuable, or is praiseworthy in some way, but you wouldn't want to say it was an action that you were required to do, or you were forbidden from not doing. So that's the kind of draws the distinction here. Now this is important because so many discussions of divine command theory seem to carry on the assumption that it's a theory about goodness in general. But I want to make it clear to you that contemporary divine command theorists do not claim that God's commands explain every single aspect of goodness. They focus solely on the deontological properties. And this is evident from the writings of those who defend such theories. Philip Quinn, for example, after defining deontological properties in the way I just mentioned, goes on to explicitly state he is not offering a divine command theory of axiological properties. And in this he's followed by other divine command theorists such as Robert Adams, William Alston, William Lane Craig, Edward Werringer, John Hare, Alvin Plantinga, and even to some extent Thomas Carson. And this is, so in the modern literature today it focuses on deontological properties. But what's interesting is that this is not unique to modern theories. If you study the history of divine command theory, the same thing is true. The older divine command theories, such as William Paley, some of you who have done biology will have heard of William Paley. He was actually a very good ethicist, a very good philosopher, and social reformer. He's often more well known for his writings on design, unfortunately. Locke, Berkeley, Suarez, all these people historically, Pufendorf, defended deontological versions of divine command theory. They did not offer divine command theories as accounts of goodness in general. So it's important to realise that when you're studying or reading this material, because there's an awful lot of stuff that says things like divine command theory defines good as what God wills. And immediately they've defined it as an axiological theory when nobody, in fact, defends that. Second point to note is there's this word because in this definition here. Now I'm going to be a picky, philosophically trained person and start telling you there are different senses to the word because. Okay? In English, this phrase because is ambiguous. So when a divine command theorist claims that an action or kind of action is right and wrong if and only if and because it is permitted by God, he could mean at least one, two or three things. I'll look at two. First thing, he could mean that one cannot know what is right and wrong unless one believes in divine commands. Or he could mean that right and wrong cannot exist independently of divine commands. Notice they're not the same claim. The claim that you cannot know what is right and wrong unless you believe in divine commands is not the same as the claim that right and wrong cannot exist independently of divine commands. The first of these is what's known as epistemological dependence. It's about justification, it's about knowledge, it's about beliefs, what philosophers call epistemology. The second is what's known as ontological dependence. And this is not the same thing. So when you see this word because, you've got to ask yourself, are they referring to, when they're talking about because, are they meaning epistemologically because, or are they meaning ontologically because? That's important. And just to kind of explain this distinction, I'll turn to a very famous example which is used just in the general literature on this very point. Take the important relationship of identity, where two things are identical to one another. And the kind of standard example that people use of an identity relation is water being identical to H2O. Now, because water is identical to H2O, it's impossible for H2O to exist independently of water. And it's impossible for water to exist independently of H2O. They're the same thing, they're identical. So they can't exist independently of one another. Yet, for thousands of years, people perceived water, drank water, swam in water, detected water without knowing anything about hydrogen at all. So even though we know it's true that hydrogen and H2O can't exist independently of water, it's false that a person can't know something is water without believing in H2O. In fact, people have done it for centuries. So this relationship of ontological dependence is not the same as epistemological dependence. Okay? So if somebody says that one thing depends on another for existence, it doesn't mean that people who don't believe in one thing can't believe in the other. And that's an important distinction. So when divine command theorists state that an action or kind of action is right or wrong if and only because it is commanded by God, it's very clear from the literature that they're using because in the ontological sense, not in the epistemological sense. And the classic version of divine command theory, probably the most sophisticated in the literature, is one put by this guy, Robert Adams. And this is what Robert Adams actually says. This is exactly the definition he uses. He says, ethical wrongness is identical with the property of being contrary to the commands of a loving God. So here he's very explicit. The relationship between the property of being contrary to God's commands and the property of wrongness is one of identity, the ontological relationship of identity. It's not an epistemological claim. And he's quite explicit about this. He says it's a relationship of identity. And he's not some lone rogue in doing this. Other divine command theories typically follow his lead. So William Alston, for example, who wrote on this theory, actually appeals to Adams and says, that's the kind of view I'm going to defend. And so does Stephen Evans. And at the more popular level, William Lane Craig, when you read his writings, cites Alston, who cites Adams. Okay? And, you know, and Craig is quite clear about this. He talks about how, when he says that our moral obligations are constituted by divine commands, he says he's talking about informative identity, analogous to the way we explain the nature of water by identifying it with H2O, or explain the nature of heat by identifying it with molecular motion. He's explicit that he's not offering an epistemological foundation. In fact, this is what he says. It would indeed be arrogant to claim that people cannot be good without belief in God, but that's not the question I'm addressing. And elsewhere he says, my concern here is with moral ontology, not moral epistemology. To repeat, my concern is with the ontological foundation, not the epistemological foundation. And if you look at all the leading defenders of this theory, they all say that this is true of Quinn, it's true of Wöhringer, it's true of Heer, it's true of Plato. All offer accounts of ontological foundations of deontological properties. And historical studies into divine command theories show the same thing. So it's important to note that, because this means that there is a whole lot of discussion about divine command theory that misses the point. And that's the kind of discussion which says the divine command theory is false because there are clearly morally good atheists out there. And that response assumes that the divine command theorist is saying that you cannot know what is right and wrong, or you cannot follow right and wrong unless you believe in divine commands. That's not what the divine command theorist is saying. The divine command theorist is making a claim about what is the nature of right and wrong, what the property of rightness and wrongness is if it exists. Okay. So there's a whole, I think, discussion which is just beside the point, which when you read the authors who defend this theory, they never said that, and they're quite often in pains to point out they're not saying that. And just to drive that point home, to see the flaw in that kind of response, you just have to think of how you would apply it in another context. Let's take the example I gave about water. Imagine if somebody said to you, look, water clearly is not identical with H2O. I know that because Thomas Aquinas knew about the Mediterranean Sea, and he didn't believe in hydrogen. It would totally miss the point. Yes, it's true, Thomas Aquinas knew what water was, and he didn't believe in hydrogen, but that does nothing to answer the question of whether hydrogen is, whether H2O is water. It does nothing to answer the question. Okay. Similarly, imagine if somebody said to you, look, the current state of the universe, it doesn't depend for its existence on the Big Bang, because I know scientifically illiterate people who don't believe in the Big Bang, and yet they believe in the current state of the universe. They see it every day. Right? That wouldn't be a refutation of Big Bang cosmology at all, because the person's confusing the idea of one thing needing another to exist with having to believe something in order to know about something. Okay? So those relations are not the same, and it's important to distinguish that. Okay, so that's what a divine command theory is. It's about ontology, it's about the nature of right and wrong, and it's about deontological properties such as rightness and wrongness. Okay. So now turning to what is probably the most common objection. This is what's known as the Euthyphro objection. And this is probably the most common objection you see in the literature on it, so I want to talk a little bit about that today. And one thing that caught my attention about this recently was, I don't know if you guys followed, there was a series of articles written in the Christchurch Press by the Canterbury University philosopher Simon Clarke. And he wrote a series of very good articles for lay people about movements in contemporary ethical theory. And much of what he thought was really, really good. In fact, it was a prize-winning series of articles. And it was very good. I have studied some ethics at postgraduate level, and most of it was really good. Everyone I didn't agree with, I thought it was very, very good, except the very last one he wrote. And that was on religion and morality, and I was astounded at what I thought how terrible that article was. And in the final article, he argued that the biggest obstacle to thinking clearly about social and political issues was religion. And the reason he said that was, this is what he said: the fallacy of grounding morality upon religion was pointed out by Plato 2,000 years ago. And that was pretty much what he said. Now, what Clarke here is referring to is to a short and simple argument that is generally considered to be irrefutable, and the argument is known by professional ethicists as the Euthyphro dilemma. I don't know if you know the history of this, but it gets its name from an article Plato wrote called the Euthyphro. And it's an interesting historical context to this because it's written before the trial of Socrates. And Socrates is about to be put on trial for corrupting the youth. And in Plato's writings, he writes in play form, and so somebody meets so-and-so and they have a discussion, and they hash some ideas out. And he meets this ancient Athenian prophet who's a very strict, literalistic polytheist. Believes literally in the Olympian gods. Many Greek intellectuals didn't believe in literally, talking this kind of myths representing something, but this guy believed this. And Euthyphro was there, and he's about to prosecute his father. And Plato is, at least in the mouth of Socrates, is absolutely shocked with this. Why on earth are you prosecuting your father? You prosecute your father. Don't you have kinship relationships with your father? Aren't you supposed to be loyal to him? And Euthyphro says, oh yes, that's true, but I have greater loyalty to the gods, and my father murdered someone. And it turned out his father had a servant who had got into a fight and got into a brawl, and so he committed some crimes. His father tied him up, put him in a ditch, and then left him to go start with people. And so Euthyphro wanted to prosecute his father for this. And so Socrates and Euthyphro get this discussion about religious ethics. And Socrates raised this question. He says, is what is holy because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's holy? Okay. Now, through the Middle Ages, that question was addressed specifically to polytheistic deities, belief in the Olympian deities. And many of the objections Plato raised only really were relevant in that context. But during the Middle Ages, people took this argument and they modified it and made it so that it could address monotheistic understandings of God. And that's what the modern phrase, the Euthyphro objection, refers to, that kind of modified or adapted version of that argument. And so when you hear people like Simon Clarke say, this was refuted by Plato 2,000 years ago, if you're familiar with literature, you know that's what he means. He's referring to the Euthyphro. In fact, he always refers to Euthyphro when you read this. So what's the Euthyphro? Well, here's a kind of good little setting out of the Euthyphro that James Rachels gives in his famous textbook, The Elements of Moral Philosophy. You guys want to read that, I take that? Right? Yeah, you've got the book there. Right. Not a great text, actually. And so, yeah, basically there's 4 propositions here, but the basic idea is it starts off with this dilemma. Is something right because God commands it, or is God commanded because it's right? Okay. So that's the here, A and B. And then the idea is that if you accept the first of these, if you accept A, if you accept that things are wrong, are right because God commands them, then you enter into these 2 problems. One, you make morality arbitrary, and the secondly, you make the doctrine of God being good meaningless. This is the claim. And so that forces you to accept, instead of A, it forces you to accept B. But then once you've accepted B, you really abandon the divine command theory, because you're saying morality is independent of God's commands. It's somehow prior to his commands, it somehow informs his commands, and so obviously can't be identical with them or dependent on them. If something exists prior to you and informs you, then it can't be identical to you, because you therefore exist prior to yourself. It's impossible to exist prior to yourself. Right? So that's the kind of idea. And so the idea is that either you make God's commands arbitrary and claim that God is not good, or you're forced to reject the divine command theory. That's the idea. So that's the Euthyphro argument in a nutshell. So what I want to do in this talk, I'm going to raise some critical questions about the first and second of these of premises of this argument. Okay, so I'm going to basically cover that. So let's look at the first one. First one is this one. Right? Now, Rachels here is giving what logicians call a dilemma. A dilemma happens is when you sort of say to someone, look, you've really only got 2 options, A or B. And then you force the person to embrace one of those 2 options, and you try and show that no matter what they do, their position is indefensible. Assumption of making a dilemma like that is that those are the only 2 options. Right? If there are other options, you're not forced onto the dilemma. And so when you see this, when Rachel puts this dilemma up there, he assumes that either A or B are the only 2 options you adopt. Either right actions are right because God commands them, or he commands them because they are right. Now, notice what's going on here is Rachels is assuming that the relationship between God's commands and right and wrong, moral properties such as rightness and wrongness, are analogous to a causal relationship. Why do I say that? Because he's suggesting that one is prior to the other. Either right and wrong is prior to God's commands, or God's commands are prior to right and wrong. Okay, that's the idea of because. Either they're right because God commands them, or God commands them because they are right. So it's assuming what's something like a causal relationship. When a cause and an effect occur, the cause is always sort of prior to the effect. The effect depends on the cause. The cause is prior to the effect. So he's kind of, can you see that? He's kind of assuming that, he's saying that either you've got to drop one of these 2 options. Now, one problem I see with this is I think that, given what I said earlier, is that most defenders of divine command theory can simply avoid both options. And that's because most defenders of divine command theory don't hold that right and wrong is in this kind of quasi-causal relationship. They hold that right and wrong in God's commands is related to identity. And identity relations are different to causal relations in this respect. Identity relations are what logicians call symmetrical, whereas causal relations are what logicians call asymmetrical. What that means is that the cause is prior to the effect, but the effect is not prior to the cause. Okay? There's asymmetry between causal relations. And however, it makes no sense to talk about identity relationships like that. You don't say, well, look, I'm prior to myself, but myself is not prior to me. It makes no sense. Of course, I'm not prior to myself, I'm identical with myself. So identity relations don't stand in this kind of asymmetric relationship that causal relationships do. And so there is a sense in which the first premise misses the target right from the beginning. Because you wouldn't, when somebody produced a theory of identity, you wouldn't say, well, is Matthew identical with himself because he's himself, or is he himself because he's identical with himself? It's a meaningless question when you talk about identity. Right? Identical things don't exist prior to one another. They exist symmetrically, they exist. They are the same thing. So the first thing is, I think one really just misses the point. But even then, I think when you turn to some really interesting things, when you turn to the second, that's right. But anyway, so let's now turn to the second premise I want to look at with the Euthyphro. Okay? And this is on one offer a couple of, I think, even more substantial criticisms here. And if you see the second premise of Rachel's argument, he says, if we accept option A, then God's commands are, from a moral point of view, arbitrary. Moreover, the doctrine of the goodness of God is rendered meaningless. So he raises here two fairly standard criticisms. One, that a divine command theory makes moral obligations arbitrary, or makes God's commands arbitrary, and that's what I call the arbitrariness objection. And two, that it renders empty or meaningless any talk of God being good. And this is what I call the emptiness objection. So let's examine both of these. Let's look at the arbitrariness objection. Okay. Rachel's in the book spells out what he's getting at here. This is what he says. He says that a divine command theory leads us to trouble because it renders God's commands arbitrary. It means God could not have given us different commands. Sorry, I'll say that again. Rachel's contends that divine command theory leads us to trouble because it renders God's commands arbitrary. It means God could have given us totally different commands just as easily. He could have commanded us to be liars. And if he had, lying would be right. Okay. And Rachel's isn't alone in raising this. Rachel's is just raising the standard criticism here. This is from Michael Tooley from his debate with William Lane Craig when this issue came up. And Michael Tooley says, if God had commanded mankind to torture one another as much as possible, then it would follow that that action is obligatory. But many people, including many religious thinkers, are unhappy with that. And in a recent book on this relationship between God and morality, the editors, Robert Garcia and Nathan King, they say this. They say, a divine command theory implies that it's possible for any kind of action, such as rape, not to be wrong. But it seems intuitively impossible for rape not to be wrong. So divine command theory is at odds with our common sense moral intuitions about rape. Okay, so you see different examples here. Garcia, King, Rachel's mentioned rape, they mentioned lying. Tooley mentions this idea of commanding people to torture one another as much as possible. For clarity, I'm going to stick with Tooley's example. Interestingly, in the most recent discussion of this is Wes Morrison's article in Religious Studies. He actually sets out this objection quite formally, so it's quite helpful. So basically the idea works like this, and the first premise is that a divine command theory entails that whatever God commands is morally obligatory. Okay? Now let X stand for torturing people as much as possible. God could command X. If so, the divine command if the divine command theory is true, X could be morally obligatory, but X could not be morally obligatory. Therefore, the divine command theory is false. Really nice way of setting the objection. Now, what I want you to note here, which is important, is the objector assumes He assumes that it's possible that God could command atrocious things like torturing people as much as possible. However, a little reflection on how this is discussed in the literature suggests that this is dubious. Because remember, we need to remember that when people are putting forward a divine command theory, they're not talking about right and wrong as being based on commands of just anyone. And this is one of the areas where modern divine command theories differs from what Euthyphro was defending 2,000 years ago. In divine command theory, they're saying it depends on the commands of God, and God is understood or defined a certain way in the discussion. And in fact, Michael Tooley himself, in his own writings, acknowledges this. He says, he defines God as omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. Note that last phrase. And similarly, in his debate with William Lane Craig, just before he makes his comment, he decides to define what he's talking about. And he says, I want to begin by briefly indicating how I'm going to understand the term God in this discussion. My view is that the question one should ask is, what characteristics should an object possess in order to be an appropriate object of religious attitudes? I think that the answer to this is that a being to be characterizable as God, in that sense, should be a personal being, should be a being that is morally perfect, that is omnipotent and omniscient. And I've highlighted the phrase morally perfect. So, as the terms are defined in the discussion by Toby himself, the claim that it's possible for God to command someone to torture someone as much as possible is only true if it's possible for a morally perfect person to knowingly torture someone as much as possible. That's how he's defined the terms. And that's how the terms are standardly defined in the discussion. But surely the very reason people like Toby cite examples like this is that they expect that any good person in the audience who hears it is going to say, I'm not going to endorse that. And that's the whole point of citing the objection. So the objection, when you actually think about it, is incoherent. Right? The objection is assuming that a morally good person could knowingly and remaining to be morally good and morally sensitive endorse something like that. So when they say God does it, but then they say, oh, by the way, no one would ever endorse that. Right? So the objection doesn't work. It only works if you assume that a morally good being who is fully informed of all the facts could support that action. Right? And that seems dubious. And if that's not dubious, if it's possible in some really bizarre circumstance that we can't think of for a morally good being to endorse that, then the claim that this is never wrong, ever in any circumstance, appears dubious. Right? So I don't think this objection works. This objection trades on the difference between what Plato was referring to back 2,000 years ago and what contemporary divine command theorists are saying today. And that's actually quite evident when you read Plato's writings, because one of the issues Plato brings up with Euthyphro is, remember, Euthyphro is a believer in the literal polytheistic deities of ancient Greece. So he's not like the Stoics or Plato or these other people who had a kind of more sophisticated view of God. He basically literally believes there's a man on Mount Olympus called Zeus who has affairs with various women and pregs against them, and there are women up on Mount Olympus who start a war with Troy and massacre lots of people because Paris didn't think they were beautiful. You know, and Socrates brings this up. If you say the commands of these deities are, you know, who can't even agree with themselves and this sort of thing. So the context that was originally put in is very, very different to the context these people are writing. And when you change the context, it's not clear that the plausibility of the argument works. Okay, so as the terms are defined, the claim that it is possible for God to command people to torture one another as much as possible is true only if it's possible for a morally perfect being to do this. But this is unlikely. The very reason critics cite examples such as torturing others as much as possible is because these actions are paradigms of conduct that no morally good person would ever entertain or endorse. That's why they cite them. That's what Tolley says. Most good people would be upset with this. So the argument then essentially states that if a divine command theory is true, in certain impossible situations that can never occur, various absurd things follow. So what? So what if absurd things follow in situations which are impossible and could never occur? It's hard to see why there's an objection to this. And this is, you know, what people point out this is a little bit like saying, if there was a round square, its area would equal the sum of one of its sides. Or if there were no numbers, if there were no prime numbers, all numbers would be prime. These are all statements about in impossible situations. It follows that impossible things would happen. These are all statements which are actually technically true in modal logic, but they're absurd, yes. But we're talking about an impossible situation. It's impossible for a square to circle have sides. And just in case you want to push this, and some people do, they say, well, maybe there is a kind of logic for impossible situations. Maybe we can talk about things being true or false in impossible situations. Well, if you take that line, then I think that what you have is not an argument against divine command theory, but you now have an argument for nihilism. Because I suggest to you that the kind of argument that's been raised against divine command theory here actually applies to any ethical theory you can think of at all, any metaphysical theory you can think of at all, that at least one that assumes that moral properties exist. I'll give you some examples. Take utilitarianism, the theory that an action is obligatory if it maximises the balance of good consequences over bad consequences. Very common theory in literature today. That's utilitarianism. But doesn't it follow from this that if torturing people as much as possible maximises good consequences over bad consequences, then torturing people as much as possible would be justified? Follows from that theory. So maybe that's just the problem with utilitarianism. So look, Kantianism, the other major ethical theory today. Kantianism holds that an action is obligatory if and only if the action treats rational creatures with respect. That is, it treats them always as ends and never as means. Now, doesn't it follow from this claim that if torturing people as much as possible was a way of treating them with respect and a way of treating them as ends and not means, then torturing people as much as possible would be obligatory? Now, of course, the Kantian is going to say, look, it's impossible for that to ever be respectful. But isn't that exactly the same line of argument the divine command theorists make? Is it possible that a perfectly good being will endorse it? So the logic in these situations seems to be the same. Same is true with virtue ethics, the view that an action is obligatory if and only if it will be performed by a virtuous person. It follows from this theory that if a virtuous person were to perform torturing people as much as possible, then torturing people as much as possible would be obligatory. Right? Now, obviously, virtue ethicists is going to say, no, a perfectly good being would never do that. Oh, really? That's exactly the same line of argument the divine command theorists make. You can't reject it from the divine command theorists and accept it for your own theory. That's called special pleading. Right? And I put to you that this will follow with any ethical theory you think of. Let P stand for any property one considers to be logically equivalent to or even identical to right and wrong. It will be true that if that property was possessed by the action of torturing people as much as possible, then torturing people as much as possible would be obligatory. So if this is a good argument, there is no property that is identical with wrongness, in which case wrongness doesn't exist. The property that's identical with nothing doesn't exist. So I don't think this arbitrariness objection works. I think this arbitrariness objection trades on mistaking the context Plato wrote in the context that the divine command theory is discussed. And once you realise that people are talking about a particular conception of God, the one that is standard in the literature of it all, perfectly good, omniscient being, then the idea that, oh, well, he could just command anything at all, and he would just command anything at all, and he would care, is implausible. And the only way you can provide the argument is to say, well, perhaps in impossible situations he could do that, and it's bad because it has this implication in impossible situations, but then that same line of argument applies to any ethical theory. Okay? And so now you've got nihilism. Alright, so that's the arbitrariness objection. Okay? But then, of course, there is the second point, and that is that the doctrine of the goodness of God is rendered meaningless. And this is what Rachel says. He says, if a divine command theory is true, then the idea that God is good is rendered meaningless. If some action is right or wrong because God permits or prohibits it, then the claim, God is good, turns into no more than the claim that God always obeys his own commands. And if so, how can God be said to be good? In fact, wouldn't God have no duties at all in this theory? And in fact, that's what many divine command theorists say. William Lane Craig says that duties are not independent of God, nor plausibly is God bound by duties, since he doesn't issue commands to himself. William Alston says the same thing. He says, we can hardly suppose that God is obliged to love his creatures because he commands himself to do so. And in fact, William Wainwright, who wrote a recent article, a book on this whole topic, suggests the notion of commanding oneself to do something is incoherent. So to accept the divine command theory, God doesn't have any obligations, he doesn't have any duties. And so how can he make sense of God's goodness? This is the objection. And this is, I think, a more important one because remember the previous one, the arbitrariness objection, failed to take into account that God is understood as a perfectly good being. But this objection suggests that that can't be the case on divine command theory. So this objection is more crucial. Okay. Now, this rejoinder that if God has no duties, he cannot be said to be good in any meaningful sense, I think has a grain of truth to it. If we're going to understand God's goodness in terms of God having duties or obligations that he consistently fills and never violates, then of course the divine command theory of this sort appears to have problems. The problem is it's not clear why the phrase God is good has to be explicated in terms of God obeying his own duties. And not only is it not clear, many theological traditions actually reject this. So many theologians, for example, have suggested that one should not understand God's goodness in terms of the following duties. And when you look at the way God is often extolled in sacred texts like the Psalms or in official creedal statements like the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's often explicated in terms of God having certain character traits. So they say to claim God as good is to say he's truthful, or benevolent, or loving, or gracious, or merciful, as opposed to certain kinds of actions which you can list, like rape, that sort of thing. And he supports other types of actions and that sort of thing. Now, nothing in divine command theory suggests that God can't have these traits. It could suggest that he's not under an obligation to have these traits. But not being under an obligation to have something, or not being under an obligation to do something, doesn't mean that you can't have it, you can't do it. Lots of things that we do in life which we're not obliged to do. Lots of things we are in life which we're not obliged to be. So it doesn't seem that this, once you understand that God's goodness can be understood in a way other than duty following, I don't think this argument really works. So in conclusion, I guess the point I'm trying to make is with divine command theory, first need to understand what it is. It's an ontological theory about deontological properties, about the duty family of ethics, the obligation, requirements, permissibility, that sort of thing. And secondly, I think the Euthyphro objection doesn't work. And I'm not really terribly saying anything I think terribly controversial in the literature today on philosophy of religion. That's pretty much widely accepted. The more interesting objections have moved elsewhere. The problem is that at a more popular level, or in other fields outside of philosophy of religion, people haven't seemed to